The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the way station, and Eleanor Hartley pressed her gloved hand against the dusty window, her heart sinking as she surveyed the desolate stretch of Texas prairie that would be her temporary home in the summer of 1878. She had traveled from Boston with her younger sister Margaret and their Aunt Constance, seeking the dry air that doctors promised would cure Margaret's persistent cough, but nothing in her sheltered upbringing had prepared her for the vastness of this untamed land. The driver helped them down, their trunks landing with heavy thuds in the dirt, and Eleanor fought the urge to climb right back into that coach and demand to be taken home. But Margaret's pale face and labored breathing reminded her why they had come, and she squared her shoulders beneath her travel-worn dress. The way station keeper, a weathered woman named Mrs. Murphy, greeted them with sympathetic eyes and showed them to a small room that would serve as their lodging until they could arrange something more permanent. Eleanor stood at the narrow window that night, watching the sun paint the endless sky in shades of crimson and gold, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake bringing them to this isolated place where civilization seemed nothing more than a distant memory. Margaret coughed softly from the bed they would share, and Aunt Constance fussed over her with worried hands, and Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on her 24-year-old shoulders. The next morning, Eleanor ventured into the small settlement that consisted of little more than the way station, a general store, a saloon, and a handful of weathered buildings scattered across the dusty ground. She needed supplies and information about finding a suitable place for them to stay, somewhere quiet where Margaret could rest and breathe the clear air away from Boston's coal, smoke, and congestion. The general store smelled of leather and tobacco and coffee beans, and the proprietor, Mr. Hutchins, regarded her with curious interest as she explained their situation. "There are not many places suitable for ladies out here," he said, scratching his gray beard. "Most of the ranches are rough operations, not fit for refined folk. But there is one man who might be able to help, though he keeps to himself mostly. Lives about 5 miles north on a good piece of land with a creek running through it. Name is Jacob Brennan. He has been out there alone for years, working that land by himself." Eleanor thanked him and purchased what she needed, her mind already turning over the possibilities. That evening, she convinced Aunt Constance that they needed to at least inquire about whether this Mr. Brennan might have a cabin or outbuilding they could rent, somewhere away from the dust and noise of the settlement. Her aunt protested, scandalized at the idea of approaching a bachelor rancher, but Margaret's worsening cough silenced her objections, and they agreed that Eleanor would ride out the next day with Mr. Hutchins, who needed to deliver supplies in that direction anyway. The journey north took them across rolling prairie dotted with mesquite and live oak, and Eleanor found herself mesmerized by the wild beauty of the landscape despite her anxiety about their circumstances. Mr. Hutchins pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the land, how it had been Mexican territory not so long ago, how the Comanche had ruled these plains before that, and how men like Jacob Brennan were trying to carve out something permanent in a place that had always resisted permanence. They crossed the creek he had mentioned, clear water running over smooth stones, and Eleanor felt a flutter of hope that perhaps this place might indeed be good for Margaret. The ranch house came into view as they crested a low hill, and Eleanor was surprised to see how well-maintained everything appeared. The house itself was a sturdy log structure with a wide porch. The barn and corrals showed careful craftsmanship, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance, healthy and well-tended. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair touching his collar beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and even from a distance Eleanor could see the wariness in his posture as he watched them come. Jacob Brennan stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt. His blue eyes narrowed against the sun as Mr. Hutchins pulled the wagon to a stop. Eleanor had expected someone rough and uncivilized, but the man before her had an air of quiet strength and dignity that immediately commanded respect. His face was weathered from years under the Texas sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both hardship and the rare smile, and she estimated him to be in his middle 30s, still young but marked by the solitary life he had chosen. "Jacob, this here is Miss Eleanor Hartley from Boston," Mr. Hutchins said. She and her family are looking for a place to stay somewhere quiet. I told her you might be able to help." Jacob's gaze shifted to Eleanor, and she felt herself being assessed with the same careful attention he probably gave to his cattle and his land. "I do not rent rooms, Hutchins, you know that." Eleanor climbed down from the wagon before she could lose her nerve, her skirts stirring the dust as she approached him. "Please, Mr. Brennan, let me explain. My sister is ill. The doctor said the dry air out here might help her lungs. We only need a small space, and we can pay whatever is fair. I can see you have a fine ranch here, and I promise we would not be any trouble." Something flickered in Jacob's eyes, perhaps surprise at her directness, or maybe recognition of the desperation she could not quite hide. He looked past her to the wagon, then back to her face, and she watched him wrestle with some internal debate. "I have lived alone on this land for 12 years, he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "I am not accustomed to company." "We would keep to ourselves," Eleanor said quickly. "We simply need a roof and 4 walls somewhere away from the dust of the settlement. My sister is only 19 and she has always been delicate. This is her last hope, Mr. Brennan." Jacob removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, and Eleanor could see the conflict playing across his weathered face. He looked out across his land, at the home he had built with his own hands, at the solitude he had carefully constructed around himself. When he looked back at her, something had shifted in his expression, or a crack in the armor of his isolation. "There is an old line shack about a 1/4 mile from the main house," he said slowly. "It was the original cabin when I first claimed this land. I've kept it in decent repair, use it sometimes during roundup. It is small, just 2 rooms, but it is solid and clean. Your sister could rest there, and you would have privacy." Relief flooded through Eleanor so intensely that she felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan. You cannot know what this means to us." He nodded once, settling his hat back on his head. "I will ride back to town with you and help bring your things tomorrow. The cabin will need some airing out and supplies. I have extra furniture in the barn." That night, Eleanor told Margaret and Aunt Constance about the arrangement. And, despite her aunt's continued reservations about the propriety of living on a bachelor's property, even she had to admit it was the best option available to them. They spent the next day preparing for the move, and true to his word, Jacob arrived early with a sturdy wagon and helped load their trunks with an efficiency that spoke of years of hard physical labor. The line shack exceeded Eleanor's modest hopes. It was indeed small, but Jacob had already been there that morning, she could tell. The windows had been cleaned, fresh wood stacked beside the stone fireplace, and he had moved in a second bed, a table with chairs, and even a rocking chair that looked handmade. The front room served as kitchen and living space, and the back room was just large enough for 2 beds with a little space between. It was humble by Boston standards, but Eleanor found herself charmed by its simplicity and the way the morning light streamed through the eastern windows. Jacob helped them unload and then stood awkwardly by his wagon, clearly uncertain of the social niceties required by the situation. "The well is about 50 yards that way somewhere," he said, pointing. "Water is good and cold. I will bring milk and eggs every few days. If you need anything else, you can ring the bell by your door and I will hear it from the main house. I am usually within earshot during the day." "You are very kind, Mr. Brennan," Aunt Constance said, her earlier suspicions thawing slightly in the face of his obvious discomfort and generosity. He shook his head. "Just being decent, ma'am. I will leave you to settle in." Eleanor watched him drive away, and she found herself curious about this man who had lived alone for 12 years on this beautiful, isolated piece of land. What had driven him to such solitude? What had he left behind to come here? But those questions would have to wait because Margaret needed her attention, needed to be settled into bed and given the tonic the doctor had prescribed, and Eleanor pushed thoughts of their mysterious landlord aside to focus on her sister. The days fell into a gentle rhythm. Eleanor rose early to start the fire and prepare breakfast, and she was surprised to find that the simpler life agreed with her more than she had expected. There was something satisfying about the basic tasks of cooking and cleaning, carrying water and tending to Margaret, that her pampered life in Boston had never provided. Margaret did seem to improve. her breathing coming easier in the dry air, and she spent her days resting on the porch in the rocking chair, watching the endless sky and the play of light across the prairie. Jacob kept his distance as promised, but Eleanor noticed him working around the ranch, mending fences, tending his cattle, and going about the business of running a ranch single-handedly. She occasionally saw him riding in from the range, his figure silhouetted against the sunset, and she wondered at the loneliness of such an existence. True to his word, he appeared every few days with milk from his cow and eggs from his chickens, never staying long, always polite but distant. About 2 weeks after they had moved in, Eleanor was drawing water from the well when she saw Jacob approaching on foot, carrying his tools toward the barn. On impulse, "Tikakor," she called out to him. "Mr. Brennan, would you care for some coffee? I have just made fresh, and it seems poor thanks for all you have done for us." He paused, clearly surprised by the invitation, and she watched him debate with himself again. "I do not want to intrude on your privacy, Miss Hartley." "You would not be intruding. My sister is napping and my aunt has gone to sketch by the creek. It would be nice to have adult conversation for a few moments." He hesitated a moment longer, then nodded and followed her to the cabin. Eleanor poured coffee into 2 tin cups, and they sat on the porch steps, an awkward silence stretching between them. She studied him from the corner of her eye, noting the way his hands cradled the cup, the scars on his knuckles that spoke of hard work, and the way he seemed almost to have forgotten how to make small talk. "Your sister seems to be doing better," he said finally. "I have heard her coughing less." "She is improving, thank God. The air here is helping just as the doctor said it might. We are grateful to you for giving us this chance, Mr. Brennan." He shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. The cabin was sitting empty, no sense in that. Still, many men would not have opened their home to strangers, especially not to 3 women who disrupted their solitude. Jacob looked out across his land, and something softened in his expression. "I have lived alone on this land for 12 years, he said quietly, as if speaking to himself as much as to her. It seemed right at the time, after everything that happened. But lately, and I've been thinking that maybe solitude is not the same as peace." Eleanor waited, sensing that he was on the verge of sharing something significant, but he seemed to catch himself and stood abruptly. "I should get back to work. Thank you for the coffee, Miss Hartley." She watched him walk away, and she realized that she was more intrigued than ever. What had happened to drive him to such isolation, and what had changed to make him reconsider it now? The next Sunday, Eleanor decided to walk to the main house to return a basket Jacob had left with supplies. She had expected to simply leave it on the porch, but he appeared from around the side of the house, pulling off his work gloves. "Miss Hartley, is everything all right? Is your sister well?" "Everything is fine, thank you. I just wanted to return your basket and to thank you again. Margaret is stronger every day." Jacob nodded, and then, surprising both of them, he said, "Would you like to see the ranch? I mean, if you have time. You have been here almost a month, and you have barely seen beyond the cabin." Eleanor's heart lifted at the invitation. "I would like that very much." He saddled a gentle mare for her and his own horse, and they rode out across the property together. Jacob spoke more freely as he showed her around, his voice gaining confidence as he talked about the things he knew best. He showed her where he planned to build a larger barn, the winter grazing areas, and the best spots along the creek. His love for this land was evident in every word, and Eleanor found herself seeing it through his eyes, in understanding why a man might choose this vast, challenging place over the comforts of civilization. "How did you come to be here?" she asked, as they paused to let the horses drink from the creek. "If you do not mind my asking." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring at the water. "I grew up in Missouri," he said finally. "Fought in the war when I was just 17. After it ended, I went home to find everything changed or destroyed. My parents had died during the war, and the farm was gone. There was a girl I had planned to marry before I left, but she had married someone else while I was away. I could not blame her for that, but it meant there was nothing left for me there. I heard about land grants for veterans out here in Texas, so I came west in the spring of 1866. I claimed this land and built everything you see with my own hands. It has been my whole world for 12 years. The pain in his voice was old, but still present, and Eleanor felt a surge of compassion for the young man he had been coming to this empty land to escape his losses. I am sorry for all you lost, Mr. Brennan, but you have built something remarkable here. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw surprise in his eyes, as if he had expected judgment or pity rather than understanding. What about you, Miss Hartley? What brought a Boston lady all the way to the middle of nowhere, Texas? Eleanor told him about Margaret's illness, about their parents who had died in a fire 3 years earlier, leaving her responsible for her younger sister. She told him about the suffocating expectations of Boston society, and the pressure to marry well, and how none of it had seemed to matter when Margaret started coughing blood. I would have gone anywhere, done anything to save her, she said simply, and somehow we ended up here. Are you sorry you came? Jacob asked. Eleanor looked around at the prairie, at the wide sky and the clear water and the peace of this place, and she found that she could answer honestly. No, I am not sorry at all. Something shifted between them that day, an understanding that had not been there before. Jacob began stopping by more often, checking on their needs, but also lingering to talk with Eleanor, and she found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with supplies or practical matters. He had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he felt comfortable. And beneath his reserved exterior, she discovered a man who read books by lamplight and could quote Shakespeare, who had taught himself carpentry and animal husbandry, and who possessed a quiet intelligence that matched her own. Aunt Constance noticed, of course, and she pulled Eleanor aside one evening with concern written across her features. Eleanor, dear, I see how you look at Mr. Brennan, and how he looks at you. I must remind you that you have a duty to your sister and that a rancher in Texas is hardly the match your parents would have wanted for you. My parents are dead, Aunt Constance, Eleanor said gently but firmly, and Margaret is improving every day. I am 24 years old, and I have spent the last 3 years caring for everyone but myself. Is it so wrong to enjoy the company of a good man? Her aunt sighed. He is a good man, I will grant you that. But this life, Eleanor, it is so hard and isolated. You would be giving up everything you have known. Everything I knew included suffocating parlors and meaningless social calls and men who only wanted my family's money. Here, I feel like I can breathe for the first time in years. Please, Aunt, try to understand. The older woman studied her niece's face and seemed to recognize the determination there. Your mother was my sister, and I promised her I would look after you girls. I just want you to be certain of what you would be choosing. I am not choosing anything yet, Eleanor said, though her heart knew differently. We are simply friends. But friendship was transforming into something deeper with every passing day. Jacob taught Eleanor to ride properly. And not the sedate side-saddle way she had learned in Boston, but astride like a rancher. And she found a freedom in galloping across the open prairie that she had never experienced. She, in turn, cooked meals that reminded him of home, of civilization, and he started taking his evening meal with them more often, drawn by the warmth of female company and the sound of conversation after years of silence. One evening in late August, after Aunt Constance and Margaret had gone to bed, Eleanor and Jacob sat on the cabin porch watching heat lightning flicker on the distant horizon. The air was thick and warm, carrying the scent of sage and dry grass, and the comfortable silence between them felt as natural as breathing. Eleanor, Jacob said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. Yeah, I need to tell you something. Her heart began to beat faster. What is it? He turned to face her, and in the dim light from the cabin window she could see the vulnerability in his expression. When you first arrived here, I resented the intrusion. I had built my life around being alone, around not needing anyone or letting anyone need me. It felt safer that way, after everything I had lost. But these past 2 months, having you here, talking with you, seeing your kindness to your sister and your strength in adapting to this hard place, It has made me realize something." "What?" Eleanor whispered. "I have lived alone on this land for 12 years, and I do not want to anymore. Please." The words came out raw and honest, and she could hear the fear beneath them, the terror of opening himself up after so long. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. You are educated and refined, and you could return to Boston and marry someone who could give you an easier life. But I have fallen in love with you, Eleanor, and if there is any chance you might feel the same, I am asking you to consider staying here with me as my wife." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. She reached out and took his calloused hand in both of hers. "Jacob, I have been hoping you would say something like this. I have fallen in love with you too. I love your strength and your gentleness, your dedication to this land, and the way you have opened your heart to us despite your fear. I do not want to go back to Boston. I want to stay here with you and build a life on this beautiful land." Jacob pulled her into his arms then, and when he kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long journey. They sat together on the porch until the early hours of morning, making plans and sharing dreams, and Eleanor felt a happiness she had never known before, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with social expectations and everything to do with the meeting of two souls who had both been searching for something they could not name. Aunt Constance was shocked when they announced their intentions the next morning, but Margaret's delighted laughter and obvious approval softened her objections. "Margaret, you cannot be serious. You approve of your sister marrying a rancher and staying in this wilderness?" "I approve of my sister marrying a man who looks at her like she hung the moon, and who has been nothing but kind and honorable to us," Margaret said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Besides, Aunt Constance, I have no intention of returning to Boston either. The air here has saved my life, and I want to stay too. We could all be happy here, if you would let yourself see it." The older woman looked between her two nieces and seemed to realize she was fighting a losing battle. "You are both mad, but I suppose if this is what you want, Eleanor, then I will support you. Someone has to ensure propriety is maintained after all." Jacob and Eleanor were married 6 weeks later in the small church in the settlement, with most of the local ranchers and townspeople in attendance, curious to meet the Boston lady who had captured the heart of their most solitary neighbor. Eleanor wore a simple dress of cream muslin that she had made herself, with wildflowers in her hair that Margaret had gathered from the prairie, and when Jacob saw her walking toward him, the look of wonder and love on his face made her know beyond any doubt that she had made the right choice. They held the wedding breakfast at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard, and food contributed by all their new neighbors, and Eleanor was touched by the warmth of the community's welcome. These were hard people living hard lives, but they understood the value of love and commitment, and they celebrated the union with genuine joy. A Murphy from the way station presented Eleanor with a beautiful quilt, and Mr. Hutchins gave Jacob a set of leather-bound books that had belonged to his late father. That night, after the guests had departed, and Margaret and Aunt Constance had tactfully remained at the line shack to give the newlyweds privacy, Jacob carried Eleanor over the threshold of the main house that would now be her home. He set her down gently in the front room, and she looked around at the space that bore the marks of 12 years of bachelor living, already imagining the changes she would make, the touches of comfort and beauty she would add. "Are you certain about this?" Jacob asked, holding both her hands. "It is not too late to change your mind. This is a hard life, Eleanor, harder than anything you have known. There will be drought and storms, isolation and struggles. I will do everything in my power to make you happy, but I cannot promise it will be easy." Eleanor reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble beneath her palm. "I am not afraid of hard work, Jacob. I am only afraid of living a life without meaning, without love. With you I have both. I choose this, I choose you, and I do not regret a single moment that brought me here." He kissed her then with a passion that had been restrained during their courtship, and she responded with equal fervor, and they learned each other in the darkness of that first night as husband and wife, discovering the ways that two separate people could become one. Later, as she lay in his arms listening to his heartbeat, Eleanor felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced, a sense of belonging that went bone deep. The months that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery. Eleanor learned the rhythms of ranch life, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast, tending the kitchen garden she had planted, and helping with the endless tasks that kept a ranch running. Jacob taught her about the cattle, about reading weather signs, and about the delicate balance of surviving on the land. She taught him about books and music, about discussing ideas and dreams, and about the small comforts that made a house a home. Margaret continued to thrive in the dry air, gaining weight and color, and by Christmas, she was well enough to help Eleanor with the cooking and household tasks. Aunt Constance, to everyone's surprise, had become friends with Mrs. Murphy and several of the other women in the settlement. And she spent much of her time visiting and involving herself in the small community's social affairs. She still tutted about propriety and the roughness of frontier life, but Eleanor noticed that she never mentioned returning to Boston. Jacob transformed before Eleanor's eyes as well. The solitary, wary man she had first met gave way to someone more open and expressive, and though he would never be talkative by nature, she learned to read his silences and to appreciate the depth of feeling behind his quiet words. He began to dream bigger, to make plans not just for survival, but for growth and prosperity. And Eleanor knew that her presence had given him a reason to think about the future in ways he had not allowed himself before. The spring of 1879 brought new challenges. A late frost killed much of Eleanor's garden, and they lost several calves to predators, and there were days when the work seemed endless and the elements harsh beyond bearing. But there were also moments of transcendent beauty, like the morning Eleanor saw her first Texas bluebonnet bloom, or the evening Jacob taught her to dance in the front yard under the stars, humming a waltz and holding her close. They learned to face difficulties together, to rely on each other's strengths, and to forgive each other's weaknesses. In June, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told Jacob one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and the look of pure joy that crossed his face made her heart swell. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hand moving instinctively to her still flat belly. "I am sure. The baby should come in January or February." Jacob pulled her close and buried his face in her hair, and she felt him trembling. "I never thought I would have this," he whispered. "A wife, a family, a future beyond just surviving each day. You have given me everything, Eleanor." "We have given each other everything," she corrected gently. "I was withering away in Boston, dying slowly from lack of purpose and meaning. You saved me just as much as I like to think I have helped you." The pregnancy progressed well, though the Texas summer heat was oppressive, and Eleanor found herself tired more easily than usual. Jacob became almost comically protective, insisting she rest often and refusing to let her do any heavy work. Margaret and Aunt Constance fussed over her as well. And Eleanor found herself simultaneously touched and exasperated by all the attention. In August, Margaret received a letter from Boston that sent her into a panic. A young man named Thomas Crawford, the son of one of their father's business associates, had written to say he was traveling west on business and hoped to call on the Hartley sisters. Margaret confessed to Eleanor that Thomas had been courting her before they left Boston, and she had been too ill and distracted to tell him not to follow. "I did not encourage him," Margaret said anxiously, "but he was persistent, and I was not well enough to be firm in my refusals. What if he comes here expecting me to return to Boston with him?" Eleanor studied her sister, seeing the young woman she had become over the past year. Margaret was now a healthy 20 years old, with sun-kissed skin and a vitality she had never possessed in their old life. "Do you want to return to Boston, Margaret?" "No, I love it here. I feel alive for the first time in my life, but I do not want to hurt Thomas's feelings, and I worry about what people back home will think if they learn we are staying here permanently." "Then you must be honest with him when he comes," Eleanor said firmly. You owe him that courtesy, but you do not owe him your life or your future. This is your home now if you want it to be. Thomas Crawford arrived in September, a pleasant-looking man of about 25 with the refined manners and expensive clothes of Eastern society. He was clearly shocked by the primitive conditions in which he found the Hartley sisters living. And his disapproval was evident as he looked around the ranch and the line shack where Margaret still lived with Aunt Constance. "Margaret, I cannot believe your sister allowed you to come to such a place," he said over dinner that first evening. "Surely you can see that this is no life for a gentlewoman. I have come to take you home where you belong." Margaret's chin lifted in a gesture Eleanor recognized as pure stubbornness. "This is my home, Thomas. I am sorry if you traveled all this way under a misunderstanding, but I have no intention of returning to Boston. The air here saved my life, and I have grown to love this land and this way of living." Thomas spent 3 days trying to convince Margaret to change her mind, but she remained resolute, and Eleanor was proud of her sister's strength. On the morning of his departure, Thomas made one final appeal. "You are throwing away your future, Margaret. What will you do here? Grow old taking care of your sister's children on some God-forsaken ranch in the middle of nowhere?" "I will live, Thomas," Margaret said simply. "I will breathe clean air and see endless skies and build a life that has meaning beyond tea parties and social climbing. I hope you can understand, and I wish you every happiness. But my decision is final." After Thomas left, Margaret cried on Eleanor's shoulder, not from regret, but from the relief of finally closing that chapter of her life. "Was I foolish?" she asked. "He could have given me security and comfort." "He could have given you a cage," Eleanor corrected. "You made the brave choice, Margaret, the right choice, and your future is your own to write now." Eleanor's pregnancy advanced through the fall, and as the weather cooled and the days shortened, she found herself increasingly uncomfortable but also filled with anticipation. Jacob had converted one of the rooms in the main house into a nursery, building a cradle with his own hands and painting the walls white to reflect the light. Eleanor sewed tiny gowns and blankets, and Margaret knitted booties and caps, and the house filled with the hopeful preparations for new life. The baby came early on a cold morning in late January of 1880. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Eleanor feared she might not survive it, but Jacob stayed by her side throughout, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, and Mrs. Murphy proved to be a capable midwife. When Eleanor finally heard her son's first cry, she wept with relief and joy, and when Jacob placed the baby in her arms, she saw tears streaming down his weathered face. "We have a son," he said in wonder. "Eleanor, we have a son." They named him James, after Jacob's father, and from the first moment he was the light of their lives. Jacob proved to be a devoted father, carrying the baby around the ranch and talking to him as if he could understand. And Eleanor often found them together in the nursery, Jacob singing old songs in his rough voice, while James stared up at him with wide eyes. Margaret adored her nephew and spent hours helping Eleanor care for him, and watching her sister with the baby, Eleanor began to hope that Margaret might find her own happiness and family someday. The younger woman had attracted some attention from a few of the local ranchers' sons, but so far no one had truly caught her interest. The answer came from an unexpected direction. In March, a new family moved into the area, settling on land about 10 miles south of Jacob's ranch. The Reverend Samuel Porter was a young Methodist minister who had come west to establish a church, bringing with him his widowed mother and his younger brother David. David Porter was 22, earnest and hardworking, and when he met Margaret at a Sunday service, the attraction was immediate and mutual. Eleanor watched with amusement and affection as David began finding excuses to visit the ranch, always polite and proper but clearly smitten with Margaret. Her sister bloomed under the attention, and by summer, it was clear that another wedding would soon take place. Jacob gave David a job helping with the ranch work, and the young man proved himself capable and eager to learn. He and Margaret were married in October. in the same small church where Eleanor and Jacob had wed, and they built a small house on the Porter family land close enough for frequent visits, but far enough for independence. The years flowed by like the creek that ran through Jacob's land, each season bringing its own challenges and joys. Eleanor gave birth to a daughter, Anna, in 1882, and another son, William, in 1884. The ranch prospered as Jacob's hard work and careful management paid off, and they were able to expand their herd and improve the buildings. Margaret and David had 3 children of their own, and the cousins grew up playing together, wild and free in a way that city children never could be. Aunt Constance passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1886, and they buried her in the small cemetery by the church, and Eleanor felt the loss keenly, grateful that her aunt had lived to see both her nieces happily settled and surrounded by family. Mrs. Murphy took over the role of family matriarch, offering advice and assistance with the same brisk kindness she had shown Eleanor that first day at the way station. Jacob never lost his love for the land, but he was no longer isolated in his devotion to it. His children climbed on his shoulders and rode with him on the range, and his home was filled with laughter and noise and the beautiful chaos of family life. Eleanor watched him transform from the lonely, wary man she had first met into someone confident and content, secure in the knowledge that he was loved and needed. Sometimes on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Eleanor and Jacob would sit on the porch as they had in the early days of their courtship, and they would talk about how far they had come and how much their lives had changed. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked her once, "giving up your old life for this one?" Eleanor looked out at the land she had come to love, at the house where she had born and raised her children, at the man beside her who had given her everything that truly mattered. "Not for a single moment," she said truthfully. "You gave me a life worth living, Jacob. You gave me purpose and love and a place to call home. How could I ever regret that? I am the one who should be grateful," he said, taking her hand. You rescued me from a loneliness I had convinced myself was necessary. You taught me that walls might protect you from pain, but they also keep out joy. I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I did not think that was possible." In 1887, the settlement incorporated as a proper town, naming itself Porter's Creek after the reverend who had established its first real church. Jacob was elected to the town council, and Eleanor helped organize a school so the children would not have to travel far for education. The wild frontier was slowly giving way to civilization, but the essential character of the place remained, and those who had built their lives there took pride in what they had created. Jacob's original claim of living alone on his land for 12 years became family legend, or a story Eleanor told the children about how their father had almost let fear and loss keep him from the happiness he deserved. Young James, growing tall and strong like his father, asked her once why Jacob had been alone for so long. "Your father had been hurt badly," Eleanor explained. "He had lost everyone he loved in the war and its aftermath, and he thought the safest thing was not to love again. But loneliness is not the same as safety, and isolation is not the same as peace. When I came here with your Aunt Margaret and your great-aunt Constance, neither of us was looking for love. We were just trying to survive. But sometimes the best things in life happen when you are not looking for them, when you are brave enough to open your heart despite the fear." "Is that why he asked you to stay?" James asked. "Yes. He was brave enough to admit that he did not want to be alone anymore, and I was brave enough to choose a different life than the one I had always known. And because we were both willing to take that risk, we found something more valuable than safety or comfort. We found each other, and we built this family and this life together." As the years passed into the 1890s, Jacob's hair turned silver at the temples, and Eleanor's face showed the lines of age and experience, but their love deepened rather than diminished. They had weathered droughts and harsh winters, sick children and failing crops, conflicts with neighbors, and the endless challenges of frontier life, and each trial had only strengthened the bond between them. Their children grew and began to forge their own paths. James showed his father's love for the land and his mother's intelligence, and it was clear he would take over the ranch someday. Anna had her father's quiet strength and her mother's compassion, and she spoke of becoming a teacher. William was still young, but he had an artistic temperament that delighted both parents, always drawing the animals and landscapes around him. Margaret and David's family thrived as well, and the two households remained close, celebrating holidays and birthdays together, helping each other through difficulties, and sharing in each other's joys. The bond between the sisters, which had brought them west in the first place, never weakened, and their children grew up more like siblings than cousins. One evening in the spring of 1895, Eleanor and Jacob celebrated their 16th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner after the children had gone to bed. They sat at the table Jacob had made when he first built the house, eating a meal Eleanor had prepared with ingredients from the land they had worked together, and they reflected on how much had changed since that day when a desperate woman from Boston had asked a solitary rancher for help. "I have lived alone on this land for 12 years, and I do not want to anymore, please," Jacob said, repeating the words that had changed both their lives. "Do you remember how terrified I was when I said that to you? I thought you would refuse me, or worse, that you would accept out of necessity rather than love." "I remember thinking that you were the bravest man I had ever met," Eleanor said. "To admit vulnerability like that, to risk rejection after protecting yourself for so long, took more courage than any battle you fought in the war. And I remember feeling grateful that you saw me as someone worth taking that risk for." "You were worth every risk, Eleanor. You are worth everything." They went out to the porch and stood together looking at the land that had witnessed their love story. The creek sang its endless song and the stars blazed overhead in the clear Texas sky, and somewhere in the darkness a coyote called to its mate. The same moon that had lit their first nervous conversations now shone on a life rich with shared history and enduring love. "We have built something good here," Jacob said, his arm around Eleanor's waist. "Something that will outlast us, these children, this land, this love. It will go on. It will go on because you had the courage to choose connection over isolation," Eleanor said, "because you were willing to say those words, to admit your loneliness and your hope for something more." That moment of vulnerability led to all of this. As they stood together in the darkness, surrounded by the land they had tamed and the family they had created, both knew that they had found what every human heart seeks: a place to belong, a person to love, and a purpose worth living for. The Wild West was slowly disappearing, giving way to progress and civilization, but the love between Eleanor and Jacob remained as wild and strong as the land that had brought them together, a testament to the power of two people brave enough to choose each other against all odds. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and the Brennan family grew and flourished. By the turn of the century, Jacob and Eleanor were grandparents, delighted by James's marriage to a neighboring rancher's daughter and the birth of their first grandchild. The ranch that Jacob had built alone in his youth had become a family legacy, a place where multiple generations would learn the values of hard work, integrity, and love. Through all the changes and all the years, Eleanor never forgot that moment when Jacob had looked at her with vulnerability and hope in his eyes and said the words that changed everything. She never forgot the courage it took for him to open his heart after 12 years of protective solitude, or her own courage in choosing an uncertain future with a man she barely knew over the safe but stifling life she had always known. And Jacob never forgot the woman who had appeared like an answer to a prayer he had not known he was praying, who had seen past his rough exterior to the lonely man beneath, and who had chosen to build a life with him in this wild, beautiful, challenging place. She had taught him that love was worth the risk of loss, that connection was worth the vulnerability it required, and that a life shared was infinitely richer than a life lived alone, no matter how self-sufficient that solitary existence might seem. In their later years, when the ranch work was mostly handled by James and William, Jacob and Eleanor would sit on the porch in matching rocking chairs, holding hands and watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. They would tell stories to their grandchildren about the old days when the West was truly wild, I knew about the courage it took to build something lasting in such an unforgiving place, and about the love that had sustained them through everything. "Tell us about when you first came here, grandmother," the children would beg. And Eleanor would smile and begin the story again, never tiring of it because it was the story of how she found her true home. "I stepped off that stagecoach in the summer of 1878, thinking I was only here to help my sister get well," she would say. "I had no idea that I was actually coming home, that this land and this man would become my whole world. Your grandfather was so stubborn and proud, living out here all alone, convinced he did not need anyone." "But he did need someone," the children would prompt, knowing the story by heart but wanting to hear it again. "He did need someone," Eleanor would agree, smiling at Jacob. "And he was brave enough to admit it. He said, 'I have lived alone on this land for 12 years, and I do not want to anymore, please.' And I said yes because I recognized in him a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it meant to be lonely even in a crowd, and someone who was willing to take a chance on love even after being hurt." Jacob would squeeze her hand and add his part of the story. "And your grandmother taught me that the strongest thing a person can do is choose to be vulnerable, to open your heart even when you are afraid of being hurt again. She taught me that isolation is not strength. It is just loneliness wearing a disguise. Real strength is building a life with someone, facing challenges together, and choosing love every single day, even when it is hard." The grandchildren would sit rapt, absorbing the lessons woven through the love story, learning about courage and vulnerability, about choosing hope over fear, and about the rewards that come from taking risks for something that truly matters. As the new century unfolded, bringing automobiles and telephones and changes that would have seemed like magic to the young couple who had married in 1878, Jacob and Eleanor remained anchored to the values and love that had sustained them through decades of life on the frontier. They adapted to progress while holding fast to what mattered most, to family and faith, to hard work and integrity, and to the love that had transformed two lonely people into the foundation of a thriving family. In the spring of 1912, as Jacob's 71st birthday approached, he and Eleanor took a ride out to the spot where he had first shown her around the ranch, where she had asked him how he came to be in Texas, and he had shared his story of loss and survival. They sat their horses side by side, looking out over land that was both wild and cultivated, untamed and productive, just like the life they had built together. "I am an old man now," Jacob said, though his eyes still held the brightness that had attracted Eleanor all those years ago. "But I have never regretted a single day of the life we have built together." "We have been blessed beyond measure," Eleanor agreed. 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and the love of a good man for more than 30 years. What more could any woman ask for? "I thank God every day that you walked into Hutchins' store looking for help, and that he sent you to me. I think about what my life would have been if I had turned you away, if I had held fast to my solitude and my stubbornness. I would have missed everything that makes life worth living." Eleanor reached across the space between their horses and took his hand. "But you did not turn me away. You were brave enough to say yes to the possibility of love, even after 12 years of convincing yourself you did not need it. That courage changed both our lives, Jacob." They rode back to the ranch house as the sun began to set. 2 people who had found in each other everything they needed to transform loneliness into love, isolation into family, and survival into a life worth living. The house that Jacob had built with his own hands now echoed with the voices of children and grandchildren, with laughter and music and all the beautiful noise of a life fully lived. That night, as they prepared for bed in the room they had shared for 3 decades, Jacob pulled Eleanor into his arms and held her close. "I love you more than the land, more than the ranch, more than anything in this world," he said. "You are the best decision I ever made." "Choosing you was the easiest decision I ever made," Eleanor replied. "Even though I barely knew you, even though it meant giving up everything I had known, my heart knew you were right for me from that first day. I just needed you to be brave enough to admit you wanted more than solitude." "I have lived alone on this land for 12 years, and I do not want to anymore, please," Jacob whispered, repeating the words that had become sacred between them. Those were the most important words I ever spoke. And the most beautiful words I ever heard, Eleanor said, kissing him softly. Jacob Brennan passed away peacefully in his sleep in November of 1918, holding Eleanor's hand and surrounded by the family he had never imagined he would have when he first claimed his piece of Texas prairie 52 years earlier. His last words were of love and gratitude, and his last thoughts were of the woman who had taught him that love was worth the risk, that vulnerability was strength, and that a life shared was infinitely richer than a life lived alone. Eleanor lived another 8 years, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren, all of whom had grown up hearing the story of how their grandparents met and fell in love. She passed away in the spring of 1926, in the house Jacob had built, on the land that had witnessed their love story from beginning to end. They buried her next to Jacob in the Porters Creek Cemetery, under a large oak tree with a view of the rolling prairie they had both loved. The headstone bore both their names and a single line that James had chosen, words that captured the essence of their love story and the courage it took to create it. He chose love over loneliness, and she chose faith over fear, and together they built a legacy. The ranch continued for generations, passed down through the family, and every child who grew up there learned the story of Jacob and Eleanor, of how a lonely cowboy had lived alone for 12 years until he found the courage to ask for more, and how a brave woman from Boston had said yes to an uncertain future because she recognized a man worth taking a chance on. The land still rolls under the Texas sky, the creek still sings its ancient song, and the legacy of two people who chose love over isolation continues to shape the lives of their descendants. The Wild West disappeared long ago, tamed by progress and civilization, but the love story of Jacob and Eleanor Brennan remains, a testament to the transformative power of vulnerability, the courage it takes to admit you do not want to be alone anymore, and the beautiful life that can unfold when two people are brave enough to choose each other and build something lasting together. In that one moment of honesty when Jacob looked at Eleanor and said, "I have lived alone on this land for 12 years and I do not want to anymore, please." He had opened a door to a future he had never imagined possible, and she had walked through it without hesitation, trusting her heart and his integrity. That single moment of courage and vulnerability had created a love that lasted a lifetime, a family that spanned generations, and a legacy that would endure long after the last memories of the Wild West had faded into history.